India's growth story will be incomplete without the full participation of women entrepreneurs. As India hurtles towards a developed nation status by 2047, we would need to enable more and more women to lead, grow, and scale. And in that, MSMEs will be critical. To discuss how we can bridge the gap between women, wealth, and work, I'm joined by someone who has been a trailblazer herself, Ms. Naina Lal Kidwai, an ardent advocate for gender inclusion and entrepreneurship in leadership positions. My first question to you, ma'am, let's keep it topical, and I'll have to ask you about the reciprocal tariffs which has been spelled out by the US. And so which are the sectors will be most impacted?
You know, the crystal ball gazing that must happen with the reciprocal tariffs is one which we will be doing for the next year, because it's one that unfolds, and now as July comes in, we will have a much greater idea as to where these tariffs will actually settle. I would just say that I was looking at a study done by FICCI, which is talking about, at the moment, what looks like negative impact and where the opportunity lies. So let's start at where and which sectors the opportunity lies. And I think the MSME sectors that will benefit are huge therein, because what has been identified in this report is apparel, made-ups, footwear, and I was just talking with someone where it's not just leather footwear, it's synthetic footwear as well. So, you know, I'm thinking, what and does it take for us to be the manufacturers for the Adidas and the Nikes, etc. Gems and jewelry looking very difficult, as in one that is negatively impacted. Electronics and furniture as positives. And the ones that look negatively impacted is quite a wide range. Marine, tea, honey, bakery products, dairy, spices, guar gum, these are the negatives. Carpets, gems and jewelry, and medical devices. And then there's a whole bunch of sectors which are not impacted, which includes pharmaceuticals, steel, aluminium, copper, automobile, auto components. But I would just add, as of now, because it's not as if these are not in the crosshairs. So a lot evolving, but some fortunately which are standing out. And for the MSMEs that are either in there, okay, to look at it, again, looking at apparel, made-ups, footwear, furniture, electronics would be areas to certainly begin to see the export potential of India. This particular export potential, I think, can happen through direct connect, through e-commerce, which is an enabler, through government policy, which I think is required to help and aid. And if you want, I could even touch on what, as MSME manufacturers, as associations representing MSMEs, what we might be required to do. But that's really your call, if you want me to touch on that.
I'll come to that in a bit, but before that, since we are enumerating the factors which will enable MSMEs to play a bigger role, one critical factor has been finance and access to finance. And this is where I'll bring in the gender aspect of it. You know, there's data which shows that the finance gap in MSMEs is 5.7 trillion. Women-led enterprises in the MSME sector represent 23% of all MSMEs, but they account for 32% of the finance gap. Is there any empirical evidence against women entrepreneurs which keeps lenders away?
So, you know, this has been an area of deep concern. I can only say that we started from a huge gap which is closing. It's closing because government has itself focused on programs to help women entrepreneurs, women startups, and that is working. So the gap is closing, but as you've correctly highlighted, there is a gap which shouldn't be there, because empirical data, and maybe we don't collect this sufficiency, rating agencies should be collecting this better for us to see how do women entrepreneurs, women-led MSMEs perform vis-a-vis male-dominated ones. And I would think that the collective data there would actually show that it's at least equivalent, if not better. But the perceptions that have been there and the ability of bankers and financiers to address this predilection to favor male-dominated industries remains. And I think recognizing that there's a perception gap, ensuring that we can correct it with the data that is available, because if the data is showing that these women-led industries are indeed strong and good, I think we will be able to get over these perception gaps better. I think there's progress made, but a lot more progress that needs to be captured and covered on this score. And you'll find in the startup industry, and in fact, as we were discussing earlier, that there is a favoring, certainly by the offshore venture capitalists and even the PE firms, to favor industries or startups which have at least one woman in the core founding group.
Thank you, brought it up, ma'am. I wanted to take off from there. There's data that I had crunched about a year back, and it was basis the stated, vision of PEVCs to look and fund startups which have at least one woman in the founder set. However, when it comes to startups, especially the tech startups, when they are founded by only women, we see funding go down year after year since post-pandemic. Now, again, perception gap there?
Yes, clearly a perception gap. And I think that is why we have to assemble data to prove why that perception is really coming from a very male-centric thinking, and that it is wrong and that it needs addressing, which can happen to some extent from some of what government enables through the funding schemes that it has. But clearly, I think data and analysis and people like you pointing it out become very important to
wider dissemination of that
sector.
analysis you made. Also, when it comes to budgets, budget after budget, we see there's intent from the government, specific women-centric funds are announced, and you were mentioning that there has been some change on the ground. But however, we still have 32% of women MSME owners suffering from finance gap.
Yeah, so it's really back to exactly this, that it's a fact, no one can deny it. What do we need to do to close that gap? And I think at one level, the technical training and skilling that happens with women, because women have traditionally not been so much in the tech startups as in startups that are much more in sort of apparel, arts and crafts, fashion, jewelry. And there's, again, I think, a focus really on those sectors rather than recognizing that women also come into the STEM fields. They do actually come out of universities with these degrees. Why are they not there in that startup universe? So we have to work both at the skilling and the encouraging at one end, but on the other with the perception gaps that exist by those that belong to my erstwhile industry, which is the world of banking.
I have to ask you this question. Ma'am, when you were heading HSBC, there was a long gap before the next batch of women bankers came about occupying the corner room. Again, once all of them had gone, it's been almost a generation we've not had a batch of women bankers occupying the top position in banks. Again, what goes in there?
You'll find that the public sector has thrown up some. Yes. But you're right, in the private sector, after we saw the ICICI women sort of spring out of the leadership change that happened there, we haven't had that same level of CEO heads at the same time, because there were, other than Chanda Kochar, who took over at ICICI, there were three others that emanated because of that. Shikha, Kalpana Moparia. We saw it also in the innovation areas with multiples coming up as well. But I think, we will just have to continue to nurture the women that are coming up through the system. And there's no dearth of women in the banking system now. So I don't think it's an area to focus on. It's an area that has been proven. I don't think women need to now prove the fact that they make for good banking heads. So it's now just a natural process, as they come through the system. And the good news is there are many there. And it isn't such a gap if you look at the fact that the public sector banks have thrown these up. The private sector can do better now, again, in terms of
We'll come back
and the gap,
yes,
when you
please.
see a long gap, I mean, the gap between when I was CEO and this next sort of clutch came up was about 5 years,
Right.
which is not a decade.
No, after
so we
you
can
demitted
tolerate
office,
that.
it's been after you demitted office and after we saw the batch which included Shikha, which included Chanda, retiring, we've not seen again a batch of...
They'll come.
Okay.
I wouldn't worry. And I don't think it's an area that needs work on anymore. It's proven, it's done. Women are very much part of that banking system, and may the best person lead. I don't think there's discrimination there. The system will throw up the best, and they will come through the system in the natural course as the next CEOs and heads. And if you look at the financial sector as a whole, NBFCs, Aditya Birla Finance, etc., there are lots of very prominent women heading finance companies, NBFCs, insurance companies, asset management companies, and indeed banks as well, through the public sector banks right now. No dearth of women there, no discrimination there now.
In my previous conversation with you, you've always pointed to the fact that while there is no discrimination anymore, because women have managed to establish that they make for great heads of finance firms, but perhaps mentorship is what is important. And with that, I'll connect to the MSME sector. How can we have more and more women pushed into the workforce?
So I think this is an important aspect, employment. And employment of men and women, job creation, and the MSMEs become critical in terms of what manufacturing means for employment. I don't believe big manufacturing is ever going to create the jobs. For 50,000 crores in an aluminium plant, you may employ 200 people. So the capital investment versus employment for large industry is never going to give India what we want in terms of job employment. But what we do need is the supply chain that will go into these large companies, which will generate more employment, and the MSME sectors, standalone as they are, in terms of employment generation. Now, this will vary. So you get the sort of SME or even MSME sectors, for example, apparel. And I remember a decade ago visiting one of our clients in Tamil Nadu, actually set up by one of the large Sri Lankan apparel manufacturers, making intimate wear. And the entire plant was staffed with women, entire plant. So working in such a manner that even though I had come in, there were a bunch of us, clearly as visitors, not one of those women looked up. They were so busy doing their little stretch on the machine before they handed over to the next. Beautiful production line. Their supervisors were women, and they had entirely hired, including those supervisors, had all come from the neighboring villages. So these were like, not more than, they'd studied maybe to the 8th or to the 10th grade, that's it. But they were here also being supervisors, so they were encouraging these women to rise to be supervisors. And what was remarkable was it took just 5 years for the social structure of the village to change, where a village where you know how the system is, women get married, they move to the village of their husband's family. These women began to insist that the men move to their village because they didn't want to give up their jobs. It took just 5 years for that social change to happen, that the men began to move to the village where these women had these jobs. And the focus that was given on the nutrition for these women at the factories, the tests and checkups, checking for anemia, giving them that milk and banana in the morning as they come, managing their entire food cycle, just superb. So we have that kind of example. It took a Sri Lankan company to show us what we needed to do, and there's fortunately a lot of replication of that. In Sri Lanka, they had the same success. Then you come to the MSME sectors, which, if they are higher tech sectors, we need to basically have more women joining sectors which stem from STEM, that we need to ensure that they see the job employment opportunities therein as well. But I should just say that across the board, the employment generation, whether men or women, and the focus that we can provide through MSME is a very big one for us. And as we look at supply chains, I think there e-commerce plays a key role. Big buyers play a key role.
Yes.
I was just meeting with some executives from Walmart, and so you get the sort of Flipkart chain, and their desire to buy from India, to buy toys, to buy furniture, to buy home products, whether it's photo frames or home textiles, apparel. These companies across the world, will buy $20 billion of product from a single country. Can we ensure that they see India as a supplier to the world? Much easier than each individual company trying to sell directly, but rather to rely on big buyers and be part of their supply chains as they supply to the rest of the world. And do we favor large aggregators of this order? I remember talking to Li and Fung, which was one of the big apparel aggregators out of China. They used to do $20 billion of product a year out of China into the rest of the world. And they were probably buying from a lot of small and large-scale manufacturers, pulling it all together, providing the product to the JCPenney's and the H&M's and buyers around the world. So we need more of such players who can help provide that avenue from our MSMEs across products into what the world wants. And I think if we go back to where, the list I'd given of those export products which can work, many will end up being smaller size companies. And it's hard to access your buyer each time or have the negotiating power with that buyer at the end of the chain. However, if there's someone who can play this role, or e-commerce itself as an enabler, then we have that potential to become a big exporter to the rest of the world. India is not a big success story on exports at all thus far, except services. So how can we become a strong export story, nascent successes in electronics and iPhones? We are not even a big apparel player. I mean, you well know that aside from China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, etc., all do a better job than we do. So where are our export strengths? Why are we not a large exporter? And it has a little bit to do with capital costs, finance, which is more expensive than it should be. There is everything to do with logistics, which we are still better than where we were. Because the logistic costs, thanks to the efforts of this government, is dropping to single digits, but it's still not competitive enough. We need to halve our logistics costs further to be truly export competitive. And then there is the paperwork and the bureaucracies that go with the export market. So how do we clean this up to truly be an exporter to the world? And that's, I think, where our MSMEs have to play a critical role. Identifying what you need and what needs to be done so we can really play into the advantages that this tariff war is going to throw up for us in India.
Of course. There's another story which India has been concentrating on, which is to get the developed nation tag by 2047. And from the examples, and you've been trying to underscore how MSMEs have played a critical role in China, or whether it's America in its early years of massive economic growth. You think it's mission critical also for India to ensure growth in its MSME sector to achieve that target?
So I've seen a study which says we cannot achieve developed company status in 2047 if our GDP isn't growing at 8%. I'm just the math of it. And we are not at 8%. In fact, the estimates are all showing more like 6.1 to 6.5 right now. So how do we bring that whole GDP growth up to 8 very quickly? Because the longer we take to reach that 8%, the longer it takes us to reach the 2047 developed economy status. And I think the only way will be if we can get, of course, our service sector, that success done, employment generation through some of the service sector, because that is a very rich employment generator. It's IT, tech, all of that, but tourism could be such a big employment generator. And what employment generation does is it creates huge domestic demand, and domestic demand drives growth.
Right.
And MSMEs can play in the tourism sector in every way, supplies into those services that are required. But then also the manufacturing, where again, the employment generation of MSMEs, as I mentioned earlier, is a huge opportunity and a critical one for us to deliver that 8% growth, which we so badly need. But in order to do that, I think if we are to really gain from the disruption in the world's trade flows right now, and it is a huge opportunity for India, there's a lot that we need to do to make sure that we can achieve it. For example, just having helplines set up, which helps MSMEs and companies to really navigate what this change looks like. There may even have to be support and subsidies for those that need to now actively...
Access to information would be as critical as...
Absolutely.
Yes.
Information, where and how best to play, what does this mean for us, how and what do we need to tide us over the tough parts. Government itself being very vigilant on dumping. I think the big fear here is if China's biggest market, the US, goes south, then where is China going to dump its product? Dump it will.
Yes.
And how do we protect on that? What do we protect? How do we stay competitive as industry? Because if we are not competitive, then in the long run, we are not going to survive either. So many aspects of how we have to transition in ways that enable us to take advantage of the benefits.
Absolutely.
Both in terms of the near term and the longer term.
Absolutely.
In terms of availing of that.
Thank you so much. We've completely run out of time, but it was a pleasure speaking to you, ma'am, and thank you for taking the time out. But before you go, we would like to request you to felicitate some of the business leaders over here.
Thank you for that wonderful conversation, Suchetna and Nainaji. Nainaji, I would request you to please stay with us as we recognize some of the business leaders and their contribution to business growth and innovation. I would like to invite on stage Arshad Nizam, Alliance Advertising and Marketing Private Limited. Mr. Rajinder Kumar, Executive Vice President, MGH Spices. Vishnu Sharma and Sapna Sharma, co-founders, FICCI Worldwide Private Limited. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Thank you.